Now, my pleasure to get to introduce Dr. Julie Washington with a session on literacy as a liberatory civil right and a tool for change. Her article, Teaching Reading to African American Students, the poll popped up. Hopefully it's popping up for you all as well. Teaching Reading to African American Children When Home and School Language Differ is a piece that's really informed our thinking at the OLC about the interplay of language, cultural dialect, and reading development. Dr. Washington's session will help us think about the role and the purpose of literacy in our lives and our society, along with recommendations for how we improve outcomes and make change with the goal of literacy as liberation. Dr. Julie Washington is a professor in the School of Education at the University of Irvine, at the University of California in Irvine. Dr. Washington directs the UCI Learning Disabilities Research Innovation Hub and is the director of Dialect, Poverty, and Academic Success Lab at UCI. Currently, Dr. Washington's research is focused on the intersection of literacy, language variation, and poverty. In particular, her work focuses on understanding the role of cultural dialect in the assessment of language competence and on the identification of reading disabilities in school-aged African American children, and on the disentangling the relationship between language production and comprehension on the development of reading and early language skills for children growing up in poverty. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Julie Washington and invite you to take the stage.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here today and to interact with this group. There's a poll that I hope you all can see, and I was hoping to take about 2 or 3 minutes to have people respond to the questions so that I can get sort of a feel for what people are thinking about literacy. And I do work focused on language, as Cassie said, and how it impacts literacy. And today's talk, there was a call to action. We know some things, we've done some things, and we need to do more. But we're going to start with the poll. So if we could just take a few minutes and people respond to the questions on the poll, I will be able to see the responses, and not individual, but the collective responses. So I'm going to stop talking and let you do that. Leela, I actually cannot see the responses.
Thank you for that.
Thanks.
You should be good to go now, Dr. Washington.
Yes, I can see it. Thank you so much. This is, the responses are interesting. I see that many of you have responded, and I am glad to see that people are as happy with their children's reading instruction as they are. It's about half and half. That's not a great number, but it's better than I expected. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for responding, and I will be relating to some of those answers that we see. Right now, I'm going to share my screen with you and begin our conversation today. If I can get these things out of the way. Okay, so I want to talk about literacy. I'm very happy to see in this conference that we are talking about literacy as something other than just an educational skill, that literacy is so much more than that. It's something that is absolutely critical from, of course, the time that our kids are very young to the time that they, for the rest of their lives, actually lifelong. But it really is more than just education. Reading is power. It gives strong readers have a lot of power in their own lives and in their the choices that they can make. I'm going to talk a lot today about access and about reading and what it means for access to so many different things. And Phyllis Hunter, who was at one time the superintendent of the Houston Public Schools, has been credited with talking about reading as a child's civil right. And she said that until the day she died a few years ago, but continued to uplift it as a civil rights issue. And there is a link to a video that I'm not going to open because I never trust them and they never work right, but it's there for you. You will share the video with you. And it's Phyllis kind of talking herself about how reading is an equity issue. It's a civil rights issue. And it means so much for the outcomes of children. And that I like that one of the questions that Cassie put forward was about intention, because Phyllis talks a lot about intentionality and how important it is to be intentional and have integrity in the way that we think about reading and teaching reading to children. And so one of the things that I've been talking about a lot lately in my own work is about reading as a social determinant of health. I've heard this morning everyone talk about 2026. Mia talked about as a number. Well, the Department of Health and Human Services every 10 years puts together a list of important skills that they consider social determinants of health, and create a list called Healthy People 2020. Now it's 2030, Healthy People 2030. And on that list, for the first time, actually, is fourth grade reading and eighth grade reading and educational outcomes, which is really critical, that we're starting to think about reading as something that's preventable, but that influence reading problems as preventable, but also contribute to optimal health through our lifespans. And that many of the concerns that we have related to health and education, long-term outcomes and welfare can be mitigated by focusing on issues related to education, and in particular to literacy. And I'm going to talk about reading. Of course, literacy also includes writing. And so I wanted to uplift this case in Detroit in 2016, where parents went to the courts. 7 Detroit families went to the courts as some of the lowest performing schools in the city, and they sued the state of Michigan in a federal court because they thought that it was a constitutional right for their children to learn to read, that children have the right to read. And in 2020, they won that case. The federal court ruled that children were being denied their constitutional right to a minimal basic education because they weren't being taught to read at least a basic level. So it was the first time that a federal court, we've seen other cases where they talk about reading, but it's the first time that it's been asserted in the federal court that children have a right to read. And so the parents in this case asserted that they weren't asking for anything, as far as they were concerned, that was outrageous, just that their kids have the opportunity to be functionally literate, that it's a fundamental constitutional right. And they argued that the education that their children were getting in the schools didn't allow them to meet this minimal standard, and it is minimal, that is absolutely minimal. You should be more than functionally literate, but you should be at least functionally literate, and that as a result, they were being denied the right to free speech, to vote, to work, and in the case of many of the kids, to pursue their dreams of higher education. These children were graduating from high school without the ability to read even at a really fundamental foundational level. It wasn't the first time, though, even though we say that it's the first time that the courts talked about the constitutional rights, it's not the first time that the federal courts have ruled on the importance of teaching reading. And in this case, in both of these cases, the children were African American, and it was their parents who took it to the courts and said, you know, we want more for our kids, our children deserve better. And so these were parents, this is called the Ann Arbor decision, and it's Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is where the University of Michigan is located. And it was the parents of 15 African-American children enrolled at, ironically, Martin Luther King Jr. Elementary School in Ann Arbor. And these parents brought this lawsuit against the school to the federal court, charging that the school district failed to teach their children to read by not considering the impact of language variation on reading acquisition. At that time, it was called Black English, and they talked about how their children were coming to school. They were using Black English, and the schools were deciding, therefore, that they were special ed and were not teaching them to read. The courts agreed. And so again, this is a much earlier case. This was in the 90s. And the courts agreed that teachers had failed to take children's home language into account when they were teaching reading, and ordered the school to accommodate the needs of these students. This was a federal case, but it was very narrowly decided. Many of the larger issues related to reading and children's rights were not decided here. And instead, the judge chose to make his decision based on a very narrow interpretation that applied to the teachers in the Ann Arbor Public Schools. And so these cases happen. They're not the only ones. This conference is taking place in Oakland, and many of you I know may remember the Ebonics debate or debacle, more likely, that happened in Oakland. It wasn't tried in the courts in the same way that these were, but it was more in the court of public opinion. And yet here we are today. So the first question that I asked in the poll was, what percentage of kids, African-American kids, you thought were not reading at grade level in fourth grade? Well, it's 83%. So it was 80%. More than 8 out of 10 African-American fourth graders are reading at a basic level or below. And this is on the National Assessment of Education Progress. And we always call it the nation's report card. And so it's a way for us to look across the country in school districts to see how children are doing. And when we disaggregate these data by race and ethnicity and socioeconomic status, we see that our students who come from different minoritized backgrounds and who are coming from impoverished homes are the ones who are really struggling with reading. And that means, though, that more importantly, about 17% of African-American children were considered proficient or advanced readers in the NAEP sample. And this was true in 2022 as well. We're not seeing a lot of change. So this is the NAEP scores looked at using a pictorial representation over many years. And this is between Black children and white children. We see similar kinds of patterns with Latino kids. And so what we're seeing is from 1992 to 2019, that there's this gap that exists between Black and white children in reading in fourth grade. And people keep talking about how it's closing. And you'll see that it really started to plateau probably 20 years ago. And so we've not seen much change at all. It's not changing significantly, and it's not changing enough to make a difference. And the fact that we see these asterisks that talk about it being significantly different, that's a statistical issue. The change that we're seeing is enough that it's statistically significant, but we're not seeing it being really significant in moving the outcomes of African-American children. So reading failure in African-American children, this notion of a social determinant of health, is considered a high impact public health concern. And it is not an issue of skills, it's not abilities. It's about access. And that's really kind of the way we're looking at it now, and certainly the way that I'm really focused in my own thinking and in my own research about what we are doing, how we are doing it, and what we need to do better. It's really about access. And so what impedes access? There are a lot of things. I'm just going to identify 3 things that are particularly salient for me in the work that I'm doing. The first one, of course, is language. The second one is culturally uninformed teaching and low expectations, which I actually think go together. And financial resources. So socioeconomic status also makes a tremendous difference in how much access you have and how well you're being taught to read, or whether you're being really taught to read at all. So first we start with language. So I saw in the chat, someone said something about, asked a question about the science of reading. And everyone knows there's a real push to make sure that we are using the science of reading to teach reading, that we know so much about reading right now, and yet those lessons that we're learning and the strategies that we're developing are not really being realized in classrooms where kids probably need it the most. And so when we talk about children who come from language backgrounds that are different from the classroom and from the linguistic structure of text, these are the kids who are having the most difficulty, and yet the children who are least likely to be exposed to or taught using the science of reading. And so one of the things that we've seen over and over again in our work is that if you're using a language or dialect that differs from the language of the classroom, or more importantly, the language of print, that it adds this extra layer of complexity because you have another step to do. And we often understand that when we're talking about kids who speak a different language, that if the text is in English and you speak Spanish or Chinese or Korean, that in order to get to reading the text, you have this extra step to do of learning the language of the text. Well, one of the areas that I'm focused on is that this is not only true for children who are learning across languages, but it's also true for children who have differences in the way that language is used in the community within a language. American English has so many dialects, many dialects of English, and some of them we know better than others, but there are many that exist, and we often see children who are speaking more than one variety, that is the language of the classroom and the language of their home, having a great deal of difficulty because they also have this additional layer and we are not considering it. So using 2 varieties can really complicate learning new language-based skills like reading, writing, and spelling, as much as using 2 languages for many children. And the more dialect that children use, the more different or further away their variety is from the language of text, the more likely they are to be having difficulty. I am at the University of California, Irvine. I've been in California since January at UC Irvine. And before that, I was in Georgia at Georgia State University in Atlanta. And in my time in Atlanta, I learned so much about dialect because there's so much. There's the Southern dialect, there's the cultural dialect. And when these come together, children use a lot of dialect, and those children who use the most are the children who are having the most difficulty managing text. And so when we get to school, we require students to master the language of the classroom, which is the language of print. This article that is on the screen is one that we wrote a few years ago. It's called The Impact of Dialect Use on a Basic Component of Learning to Read. It was written in 2015 by myself and some of my colleagues at the University of Wisconsin when I was there. And one of the things that we have talked about a lot when we talk about reading and kids who use different language varieties is the mismatch hypothesis. So this idea that the difficulty with learning to read for children who speak different language varieties relates to the fact that children are experiencing text and oral language that don't match. That's the idea of the mismatch hypothesis. And the thinking is that if you have an oral language system that doesn't mismatch print that it's much harder to learn to read and you have so much more work to do. So Mark Seidenberg, who is a reading researcher and is an author on this article, and I were talking about this issue, and he does computational modeling. And so it's building these theoretical models to test a hypothesis. And so I asked him if we could test the mismatch hypothesis. So that's what this article is. And just briefly, what we found was that when the model experienced text and oral language that matched, that it took approximately 300 trials to get to 75% mastery. When the model encountered oral language and text that didn't match, it took more than 1,000 trials to get to 75% mastery. So it took many more trials, much more work. And this is what we believe is happening to many children who are not being, who are encountering text that certainly they know language and they have great language skills, but the kind of teaching that we're doing with literacy doesn't take into account when you're talking about children who are English speakers, that their use of English and some of the differences that they bring to the classroom are influencing how they relate to text. And so if you speak a second language, there are federal laws that you can use to push teaching and learning, but these same remedies and protections really don't exist for native English speaking kids whose language impacts reading. And so that's why some of these federal cases were really important, because we know that the courts can certainly give us some teeth when it comes to trying to address these issues with students who are native speakers of English. So the second thing that we know impedes access is teaching. And so culturally uninformed teaching, not taking into account the backgrounds, both in terms of race, ethnicity, and culture, but linguistic as well. We don't take these into account often in the classroom, and we see the results for children who are struggling with reading or who are just trying to learn to read. And so when we talk about the content of books, the use of culturally relevant texts really anchors cultural knowledge, so that children see themselves in books makes a big difference in terms of thinking about the motivation to read or even the connection to books at all. So your identities, your experiences and norms have been found in research for an awful long time to impact whether kids are interested in reading and whether they become really good readers. And so we all are using this metaphor a lot now that Bishop created in 1990. I know she must be thinking, it's been, many years, it's been 30 years and people are just starting to sort of grasp and hold on to this idea, but it's so relevant today. And so it's the idea that books are mirrors, so you should see yourself in a book. And when you open a book and it's not just about being brown or being Black, it's about your identity, that you should be able to see that in a book. That's a mirror. But we also know that books are windows to new places and new worlds, and you can lose yourself in a book and really learn about all kinds of things in a book. So we look for them to be mirrors, we look for them to be windows. But one of the things that's often missing, I think, is the sliding glass door. And so making reading transparent, easily opened, inviting kids into the story and helping them to walk through that door and become good readers. And so it's not enough just to have the mirror. It's not enough to have the window. The sliding glass door often gets overlooked, but for many children, that's the most important thing. Giving kids access to the books that we want them to master. And so this idea of being culturally informed is really, really important for kids. And every year at the University of Wisconsin in the School of Education, they do this look at children's books that have been published over the year, and they look at the diversity in children's books. And so this is the one for 2019. This is our pre-pandemic look. I'm guessing we're not going to get one for a little while for 2020 because of the pandemic. But if you look at the representation of children from different backgrounds in books, half of the representation is white kids. And then the next highest representation is animals, 27%, more than twice as many as African American kids, all the way down to our First Nations kids, American Indians, who are only seen in books about 1% of the time. And so this idea of the mirror as sort of the foundation for getting kids interested in reading, motivated, and giving them access, we have so much work to do. We're so far away from that standard. And it's important to note that in this survey every year, it really focuses on race and ethnicity. There are a lot of other issues as well: children's identities, homelessness, children who are refugees, children who are LGBTQ who do not see themselves in books, and they need to. Otherwise, are books really relevant to them? That's the idea of this. So being more culturally aware. Low expectations, I think, goes along with this. I think our expectations for children really influence our actions. So research indicates for a long time, the very first study you'll see, that big study that focused on low expectations, was in 1968. That's a long time ago. And what they found was that teachers having higher low expectation is a self-fulfilling prophecy. So it goes in both directions. If you have high expectations for the students in your class, you see students performing higher because you expect them to. Well, the same is true for low expectations, and that's something that we see, especially in the classrooms of our children who are growing up in poverty, that often there are just not very many expectations for them. I serve on the board of a school for homeless kids, and one of the problems that we have had is this idea that's so bigoted that whatever we do for these kids is better than what they've already got. That's not good enough. Our expectations for those students should be as high as they are for other students. And certainly, if you're a teacher, the expectations for the students sitting in front of you should be what you want for your own children, because children rise or fall to meet our expectations. And so low expectations, when Rod Page was the Secretary of Education, he called it the tyranny of low expectations, and talked about how this overarching problem with expectations for children impacted what we were seeing on the national landscape, both in terms of reading and mathematics. And I know that when he was Secretary of Education, that he really focused on that as an issue. And so low expectations, and I think being culturally tuned in and being aware of who's sitting in front of us, what their needs are, and what we should be doing in order to meet the needs of the students sitting in front of us, certainly go together and really impact student outcomes. So, excuse me, we find that there are a lot of variables that influence this. Whether teachers have high expectations, often it's nothing about the students' actual performance. It's about what they look like. It's about where they live. It's about how they talk. And it's about whether they're boys or girls. And so if you are low income, Black, a boy, and you have linguistic differences, we find that the expectations for you are the lowest of all. And when we look at our data, we are finding that African American boys at 4th grade, we're starting to see them slide, and that it's a permanent slide. It's not just, they talk about the 4th grade slump. It's only a slump if you recover. And what we're not seeing is recovery. And so this low teacher expectations is significant. It's not sufficient to account for the differences in performance that we see with African American children, but we know that it makes a really big difference. And the final, but certainly not the least important area in terms of access is financial resources. I really like this quote from a parent in the Detroit case. It's just unfortunate that in America, zip codes matter when it comes to an education, and it shouldn't. And this quote really got my attention because in my own work, instead of using parent income, I use zip code. And so, the idea that we see these major differences, and I used to use a map when I was working in Atlanta that showed that the majority of the reading problems in the city were in the same part of the city. And it was true across major cities in the state. But if you looked at Atlanta in particular, most of the kids lived in Southwest Atlanta, same zip code. That's where we were seeing the preponderance of literacy problems. So zip code really matters. And as this parent said, it shouldn't. And just briefly, again, this is a pictorial representation of what's happening with the achievement gap in reading. So we see the reading gap is shrinking slowly, very slowly over the years, unless you're low income. And then we don't see it shrinking at all. We see that for those students, if you look over time, and this is over these graphs are over a 70-year time period, and this is from Sean, I can't remember his last name, sorry, from Stanford, who talks about income and how much difference income makes in terms of how students are performing. And it just doesn't make any sense at all. Sean Reardon, I'm sorry. And so he talks about how income really influences outcomes, and it really shouldn't, but it does. If our students are coming from impoverished backgrounds or their families experiencing homelessness, those are the children whose scores are the lowest. And it really doesn't have anything to do with ability and has everything to do about some of the other things I talked about language, about expectations, about being relevant to students and encouraging them to see reading as something that's important for them. And so the caution that Reardon gives us is that income has become a much stronger predictor of how well kids do in school. Race is as important as it's always been. We always are continuing to see differences by race, but income has gotten more important, not race less important. So if you are, as I said, from a minoritized background and you're low income, we really see reading not actually getting better. It actually is continuing to decline. But I always like to say that middle income African-American kids are also falling behind their more affluent peers. The gap between middle income children and poor children is largely unchanged. But if you look at middle income children compared to children in the highest income group, those children in that high group are growing rapidly. The children in the middle income group are growing, but not fast enough. So we don't see the gap close. We're just seeing it go in parallel. So as we think about what to do, we're talking about really educational reform. When the pandemic started and schools were closing, there was a lot of talk about this is our opportunity. This is our opportunity to change schools. It's our opportunity to do the right thing. But what we usually do is we look at that opportunity, we talk about that opportunity, we've no idea what to do, so we come back and do all the same things. We saw that in Katrina, where the school district basically blew up because of a major weather event. And when school came back, some things changed, but a lot was still the same. And we're still seeing the same disparities and differences and inequity in education that we saw before Katrina. The courts have gotten involved in changing schools for a long time. Remember Brown versus the Board of Education? That was 1954. It's been a long time. And these incursions into education, whether it's reading, whether it's the entire educational system like Brown, they provide this precedence. They don't change practice at all. And they really have had very little impact on our achievement gaps. The disparities continue to exist, but they provide the precedence that we need as individuals who are interested in educational reform to change schools and to have some support in order to do that. But courts don't change school quality or equity. Parents and communities change that. And so even in the Detroit case, it was parents who engaged the legal system. They're the ones who got that victory. And so when parents come together, they bring their voices together, that's when we really see change. And we really have the opportunity to do it right now. We've always had the opportunity. The pandemic didn't make that, from my perspective, any better or any worse. It's always been there. And the courts are helping us out a bit, but it's up to us as educators and individuals to change the way that we teach, change the way that we support students, and change the access that we're giving parents to our schools, and the empowerment of parents, which is something anybody who knows me knows I'm really passionate about. So how do we achieve this systemic, institutionalized kind of change that we need? I wish I knew the answer. I'm raising the question and the call to arms. So with each court case, we get this opportunity to capitalize on the rulings, but it's fleeting and it goes away. Like many people were talking about the Detroit case a couple of years ago. I know we had the pandemic in the middle, but what are we going to do to capitalize on that and move things forward? How do we mobilize families and communities in the best interest of our children's education, and especially reading instruction? One of the things we need to accomplish is mindset shifts that acknowledge the genius of all children beyond circumstance. I think that's really, really important. And I see this Frederick Douglass quote a lot. In fact, I've seen it on t-shirts. Once you learn to read, you will be forever free. It's absolutely true. And I love this. I don't know if Teach for America would like it that I'm doing this, but I love that they talk about how in life, our beliefs drive our actions, and the same is true for teaching. The same is true for learning. The same is true for reading. Whatever we believe is what we will act on. And so what do we believe? How are we acting on it? And how are we taking advantage of the opportunities that are being provided to us as parents, as educators, as researchers, as community members to make impactful and lasting change? Culturally relevant pedagogy equips teachers to provide an education that recognizes and celebrates kids, and education that nurtures their brilliance and their potential. But we don't see that happening in our schools. And what do we need to do to make sure that literacy, the civil right, the right of every child to learn to read is realized? And we're just not doing it in our schools. I know Oakland is working on it in some ways that I haven't seen before, and I'm excited to be involved in this meeting today as a result. But this is our time, and it's an important time as we're seeing state legislatures changing laws and adding laws that focus on things like dyslexia and reading and structured literacy. I don't want for the children that we're talking about today to be left behind in all of this, because that's what's happened in the past. And I personally believe that only the people who are in this meeting and meetings like this really have the power to keep that from happening again. Thank you. And I'm going to stop sharing and answer any questions. Oh, thank you, Will, for the video. I'll have to take a look at that. Are there any questions I can answer?
And folks should have the ability to come off mute. So if you, feel free to put your questions into chat, but also feel free to take yourself off mute if you'd rather share it.
I have a question, Dr. Washington. Hi, it's Deborah Schlegel. How are you?
Hi, Deborah. How are you?
I'm good. Thank
Good.
you. So if you could have your wish in terms of legislation, what would you be pushing for?
Because of my own personal interests, I would be pushing for language legislation, actually, that considers not just foreign language speaking, but also children who are within language speakers who are struggling with reading because of language. I think it's so important. It's something you've been struggling with a lot in California for as long as I can remember. I know the LA Unified School District, Compton, Oakland, many school districts have been struggling with this. I would like to see when we are enacting legislation that we don't consider minoritized students as an afterthought. That would be my biggest wish, that when we're talking about meeting the needs of all students, that we include all students. in the decisions that we're making, in the assessments that we're developing, in the curricula that we're developing, in the legislation that we're putting forward. And right now, we're not doing that. We are treating those students like they are add-ons or afterthoughts, and that's what it looks like when we start trying to teach and its impact on learning, that the things that we're doing and the legislation that we're enacting does not meet the needs of those students because they're not included. It shouldn't have to be separate legislation for students. It should include all students and all students in the language, and then therefore in the actions that come from that legislation. And that's just not what we've been doing. Any other questions?
There's a question in the chat. Are you seeing it?
I actually am looking through the chat.
Okay.
If functional literacy is the minimum, is there a grade level equivalency? Gloria, can you expand on that a little bit so I can answer it for you?
Yes, it's Gloria.
Gloria.
I have encountered individuals in my circle of influence who are illiterate, and they have gone through 12th grade. So some time ago, I can recall someone saying that there was a certain grade level that was necessary to be able to read a newspaper.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, in terms of being in an educational setting, if the parents in Detroit were asking that their children have functional literacy, at what grade level would those parents have expected their children to have, quote, completed to be able to have achieved that functional literacy level?
That's a really good question. We know that currently, if you go to the airport and you buy a novel, most of them are written at 7th grade. And so 6th or 7th grade is the minimum that we need for students to get to be functionally literate. 8th grade at high school graduation means you're a pretty good reader in the United States, actually. I see that in the chat. But I know that, for example, when I'm doing consent forms for parents, I do equivalencies that are around 5th or 6th grade to be sure that parents have some chance of reading them. So the level at which you attain functional literacy is not that high, actually. Rebecca Buckley, you're welcome. Do you have a follow-up, or did I answer your question? Gloria?
Yes, you did. Thank you.
You're welcome. So Rebecca, could you comment on research on family language use by economic level following the 30 million word gap study? Well, the 30 million word gap study, that's Hart and Risley. It's an older study, I think it was 1995, that people reference a lot and is being used to influence legislation at the state level in a lot of places. And it's coming under fire because one of it was a land breaking study when it happened. And so these students who were low income, and these were students whose families were on public assistance, and students who were working class, those were considered the middle income kids, and then the upper middle income kids who were like, convenience sample, because these were college towns, were like professors' kids. And so they looked at the number of words used by children at each level and went into the homes and recorded the kids every month for like 5 years. It was really a land-breaking study. And so, of course, what they found was that the children who were low income compared to the kids who were in the higher income group, that the words that they heard by 3rd grade or by 3 years old, not third grade, by 3 years old, the kids in the higher income group had heard something like 3 times as many words as the children in the low income group. And by the time they got to school, we're talking about a gap in words that they've been exposed to that created a 30 million word gap. So that's the idea of the 30 million word gap. And interestingly, the study has recently come under fire because the low income group was all African-American kids. And a lot of the problems that Hart and Risley saw in their study with the way that kids were using language, they talked about parent languages and what parents were doing, what parents weren't doing. And so there's a lot of parent blaming and there's a lot of pathologizing the differences that they saw in the homes of low income kids and using those to account for the differences in performance for those kids. So the 30 million word gap study was it was an important study with a lot of flaws. And before he passed away, I had the chance to meet Todd Risley. And one of the things that he said about it was that he was saddened by the fact that everybody was focused on the number of words instead of the quality of the interactions, because that's what they were trying to get across. That when children were engaged in interactions that were transactional, where it's back and forth and where they're having high quality conversations and interactions, that's what spurs language development. It's not just that we need to make sure that by the time a child finishes kindergarten, they know 1,000 more words. That's not the point. The idea is that if the talking is high quality, then the quantity will come. And so that is the idea of the 30 million word gap and what it means. And the quality of the interaction is critical.
Yeah, I just wasn't sure if any additional research had been done because that initial research broke down numbers by socioeconomic level, and I wasn't sure if further research had been done along those same lines and discovered, something new or.
Not really. I just talked to my students about this in class on Tuesday, and we read a paper where the author was talking about social influences on language development, and one of the influences was poverty. And so when we looked at her study, she had 3 pages of negative issues related to being impoverished in language and 1 paragraph related to strengths. I think that's a problem. And some of that comes from studies like the Hart and Risley study, where we look at low-income kids, we see that they're doing things differently or less than we should expect. We pathologize those things and then conflate the intelligence of the child with their language use, which is really problematic. And that's actually what came out of the Hart and Risley study, which is really unfortunate and why it's coming under fire. It was important, but as a scientist, in fairness to Hart and Risley, who have both passed away, you can't interpret how people filter your study and interpret it in a larger context. And so that's not exactly what they meant to have happen, but it has happened. And so what we saw in this paper was that we were reading as a class is a study comparing low income and middle income children. Low income children do worse. A study comparing low income children and middle income children. Low income children do worse. And on and on. It was like 20 studies. I'm like, okay, that's enough. We got the message, and what are we learning that's new? What are the strengths of these students? What should we be building on? How should we be bootstrapping on what they know and not just focusing on what they can't do and what they don't know? That is that tyranny of low expectations. It pushes us to not expect as much from students because we don't think they have as much. So it was a great effort, that study, the 30 million word gap study, but it has contributed to some inequity. And I'm speaking for myself, not the world. This is my view of that study.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, Jethro Rice says that the Hart and Risley study is not easily replicated. I don't know if it's replicable. So it's one of those things that I just don't know if we're going to be able to replicate it. And Alexis asked, what should we be building on? You know, when students come to school, they're not blank slates. They know a lot, and they know a lot about a lot of things that sometimes are compatible with what we're doing in the classroom and things that aren't compatible, but constitute their knowledge base. And so that's what we should be building on. But that requires that we understand our students. Yes, okay. So I thought it was a question, because it is true. Students know so much, and it takes taking the time to learn who your students are, where they come from, and what they know, and then building on what they already know. But you have to take the time to get to know them and know where they come from, know what they believe, know what they value, and then you value that and build on it.
I see one more question. I think we probably have time for one more
Okay.
question. Polly Mayer writes in the chat, has the digital age diminished the quality of verbal interactions across SES? In other words, all the time we spend on screens, phones, etc.
That's a good question, and it's a common question, and there is no answer yet. There's a lot of anecdotal talk about how kids are spending all this time on screens, and so they don't know how to interact and all of these things. And I don't know that that's true. Of course, if you think about it logically, that a student who's spending a lot of time on screen isn't interacting with people, and so they're not getting those skills. But there's no empirical evidence to really support that. I am a little concerned about what the pandemic did to social skills and to language and interaction. I am seeing a lot of kids, especially little kids, and people aren't really focused yet on the social emotional impact of the pandemic, except that kids are kind of depressed. But what I mean is, like, I had my little cousins come visit me during the summer. When you move to California, everybody comes to visit. And so they're 4 years old. They were scared of everything, birds, sand, everything, because they've been in the house for 2 years. And so they hadn't had a lot of experiences because their parents were protecting them. So they didn't know a lot. I have a friend who has a granddaughter who, the first time she saw a kid her height, and she's 2. So she was born during the pandemic and she's grown up in the pandemic. Every kid she sees who's her size, she gives them a hug. It's really sweet, but it's off-putting for the other kid. And so it's this idea, and I don't know what teachers are experiencing as students are coming back to school, not having been in school for a while, and now they are having to figure out how to manage not only the academic piece, but the social, emotional, and pragmatic piece of interaction in schools. I haven't heard about that yet, but I'm certainly seeing it in some of the little people I know. That's funny.
Thank you so much.
You're
Dr.
very
Washington.
welcome.
Please all join me in thanking Dr. Washington for this just incredible session and sharing your brilliance and expertise with us all. Thank you for lifting up the research and the data and laying out the challenge and the call to action and how we can increase access. Because we know these issues aren't new and they aren't an accident and they aren't happenstance. But there is an opportunity to do better, and really appreciated what you said about making sure that we include all students in the decisions that we're making and in the policies and curriculum and legislation that we're setting forth. So yes, thank you for urging that.